How do you go from winning a Nobel Peace Prize to being accused of horrific war crimes in just 2 years? That's the situation facing Ethiopian Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed. For months, Ethiopia's been in the middle of a violent civil war with the Tigrayan people, an ethnic group that lives in the country's north. As many as 50,000 people are said to have died, which, if true, is more than any conflict anywhere in the world in 2021.
Undoubtedly the major humanitarian crisis in the world today.
Abiy's government is being accused of committing war crimes and putting millions of its own citizens at risk of dying from starvation. And the United Nations has just announced that more than 400,000 Ethiopians are currently experiencing famine.
There is absolutely no doubt that international crimes on a horrendous scale have been perpetrated.
So, how did it go from a Nobel Peace Prize to this? To answer that question, we need to take a closer look at the rise of Abiy, as well as the 4 stages of Ethiopia's recent leadership. Ethiopia is a diverse country with distinct regions and lots of different ethnic groups, like the Tigrayans. That's because for centuries, right up until the 1970s, Ethiopia was actually an empire ruled by an emperor, one of only 3 in the world at the time. This empire was built on conquered nations, and many of the ethnic groups within the empire were treated as second or even third-class citizens. One of the nations taken over by the empire was Eritrea. It's a key part of this story, so remember that name. Eventually, the Ethiopian Empire was replaced by a brutal communist dictatorship led by Colonel Mengistu.
A very brutal government that killed untold number of Ethiopians, that really was destroying the foundation of the nation.
They have what is called the Red Terror, where there's killing of large numbers of political opponents. At least 30,000 people are killed during that period alone.
Militias around the country popped up in response, and civil war raged for decades. 2 of the strongest militias were the Tigray People's Liberation Front and the Eritrean People's Liberation Front. When Mengistu was finally overthrown in 1991, Eritrea declared independence, leaving the TPLF as the most powerful force in Ethiopia. The TPLF formed a coalition with other political parties known as the EPRDF that went on to rule the country for almost 30 years. During this period, the country did make a lot of progress and began to develop its economy, but it wasn't quite as open and democratic as some had been hoping. The coalition effectively made Ethiopia a one-party state, and because Tigrayans dominated that coalition, they basically ran the country, even though Tigrayans were only about 6% of the population. While in power, the Tigrayan political elite ruled with an iron fist.
The TPLF-dominated EPRDF has always been a very authoritarian, highly repressive system.
Political opponents and activists were known to be thrown in jail. Journalism was restricted, and elections were regularly accused of being rigged. To add to all of this, a war with Eritrea began in 1998, a conflict that would go on to last for decades. Just quickly, the TPLF was accused of favouring Tigrayans while in power, but even if this was the case, the region of Tigray still remained extremely poor.
I personally went to the Tigray region. The people are the poorest people I've ever seen.
Eventually, frustrations against the TPLF and EPRDF started to boil over.
There was a persistent protest movement that began in 2015 and went all the way up to 2017, forcing the then Prime Minister to resign.
The man the government chose to replace the outgoing Prime Minister was Abiy Ahmed, and this is where he comes into the story. Abiy was seen as a young and dynamic politician, and often spoke of peace, reconciliation, and unity.
The impression that was created was that this is going to be a man that would turn stone into gold.
Even though he wasn't Tigrayan, to the TPLF, Abiy seemed like a safe choice. He was popular, already a part of its coalition, and they believed he would keep the status quo and help the TPLF maintain its influence. But Abiy had other plans in mind. He began to remove corrupt TPLF officials from power, political prisoners were released, and journalists were given more freedom.
We are creating an Ethiopia that is second to none in its guarantee of freedoms of expression.
Abiy also started a new coalition known as the Prosperity Party. The TPLF were invited but refused and decided to join the opposition. Abiy's most well-known act, however, was reaching out to Eritrea and ending the war that had been going on for decades. This is how he won the Nobel Peace Prize.
I truly believe peace is a way of life, war a form of death and destruction.
Things seemed like they were going well for Ethiopia, and that they were finally moving away from years and years of authoritarian rule. But inside the country, conflicts between ethnic groups were flaring up. Abiy responded to all of this by going back to some of the methods used by those before him. Once again, political opponents were being locked up, journalists were put under pressure, and police were responding brutally to protest movements building across the country.
In our report last year, we documented that tens of thousands of people were arrested in military camps.
Although some say Abiy had already been working to shut down opponents and cement his power before all of this. Then came COVID. Like many other nations, Ethiopia decided to postpone its elections. Opponents accused Abiy of using the pandemic as an excuse and said that he didn't want to face an election. The Tigrayans went one step further and defied the government by holding their own elections the following month. What followed were reports of the Ethiopian government mobilising its military. And in the early hours of November 4th, while the rest of the world was watching the US election, Abiy issued a statement that the Tigrayans had attacked a military base and that they'd be forced to respond with military action. The two sides were now at war, although Abiy and his government refused to refer to the situation as a war. In the early stages, it was referred to as a law and order operation against politicians who had defied the government and needed to be brought to justice. Abiy also said it would be over in weeks and would be entirely bloodless. After a while, it became clear that both of those statements weren't true. In the first couple of months, no one outside of Ethiopia really had much of an idea of what was going on.
This is a war that has been fought in darkness.
Internet access was shut off. Journalists were not allowed to go. There was no cell phone access.
Details started to trickle out eventually, with more than 60,000 Tigrayans fleeing across the border into Sudan.
The number would be much higher. There are about 2 million displaced within Tigray, but they are essentially confined there. They can't get out.
They came with stories of not just fighting between the military and militias, but of massacres of civilians and widespread sexual violence.
13 years. They killed a 13-year-old child?
Yes. You have to address the world to come soon.
There have also been signs of widespread hunger across Tigray, a place that's already vulnerable to food shortages.
Much of the region can't even be farmed, so they're forced to bring their basic foods from outside of from other states.
On the land that actually is usable, many farmers have been prevented from planting crops. Not only that, but the Ethiopian government has been accused of destroying supplies and cutting off regions controlled by Tigrayan forces.
It is a 100% man-made famine. 100%. Starvation is being used as a weapon of war, as a weapon of elimination, in a way that in my 30-odd years of researching this topic, I have simply not seen. It is planned, it is coordinated, it is systematic, and it has brought 5 million people to the point at which they are essentially reliant on an international pipeline of essential aid that is being choked off by the Ethiopian authorities.
The UN Refugee Agency has gained access to the Shemelba and Pitsis refugee camps. We found both camps completely destroyed and all the humanitarian facilities looted and vandalized.
The United Nations says that all sides of the conflict have been carrying out atrocities, but that the vast majority have been perpetrated by the Ethiopian military and its allies. And that brings us to a key point. The Ethiopian military hasn't been acting alone. Abiy allied with the Eritrean military to attack his own people, something the government denied at first. Eritrea is led by President Isaias Afwerki.
He is a dictator, without a question, who smirks at questions about democracy, the rule of law, and human rights.
If you're wondering why a nation would even want to get involved in another nation's civil war, remember that when Ethiopia went to war with Eritrea, it was the Tigrayans who were in charge.
Eritrea lost the war. Eritrea was also sidelined internationally because of pressure by the Ethiopian government. So Isaias has always wanted the opportunity to make TPLF pay.
Not only that, but Eritrea sees the neighbouring Tigray as a threat to its national security. Internationally, there has been a huge amount of pressure on Abiy to stop the fighting and to send the Eritreans home. Now, it seems as if the Eritrean military are finally starting to pull out, and the Ethiopian government did recently announce a ceasefire. However, it was rejected by the TPLF, who said that they won't stop fighting until all enemy troops have left the region. Experts fear the fighting will continue to spread, and millions more are at risk of dying from starvation if regions in Tigray continue to be cut off from food aid and essential services. The Ethiopian government continues to deny that this is happening, even though there have been reports of trucks with aid being held up and bridges into towns being destroyed.
There is no hunger in Tigray, there is a problem in Tigray, and the government is capable of fixing that.
So, what happens next? One solution being floated is that Tigray separates from Ethiopia and becomes its own independent nation. It might seem like a simple solution, but experts warn it would likely be disastrous and lead to more violence and potentially even Ethiopia completely falling apart if other ethnic groups in the country try to follow the Tigrayans' lead and push for independence themselves. One of Africa's biggest countries collapsing would be disastrous for its neighbours and likely lead to fighting over territory and an even bigger refugee crisis. According to experts, the only way to get through this without further violence is getting all of the ethnic group leaders and political party leaders together to negotiate a path to peace and a new direction for Ethiopia.
The only ways through which Ethiopia could hope to achieve that is through a national dialogue process, and the Ethiopian government has so far rejected the possibility of national dialogue.
Instead of a national dialogue, Abiy decided to hold the elections that he'd originally postponed because of COVID during a time of civil war and widespread violence, effectively achieving the opposite of a national dialogue by excluding millions of Ethiopians who weren't able to participate. For now, many Ethiopians of all ethnic groups and people right around the world are just hoping to see an end to the ongoing violence, and for the enormous number of Ethiopians that are currently starving to be given the help that they desperately need.